Uh, Thank you all for joining us for our webinar, New York State's Plans for Legalized Cannabis. Today we have three fantastic panelists in New York, Osbert Orduña, Katie Neer, and Kaylin Castetter. But first I want to talk about our sponsors. Englewood Construction, with national experience with high-end retail and secure industrial facilities, Englewood Construction is a practical choice for cannabis facility construction. Our stable of diverse and equitable partners lets Englewood Construction create your vision anywhere in the United States. American Cannabis Company, operating a vertically integrated or standalone cannabis business, has unique and complex challenges. American Cannabis Company provides consulting and solutions to increase efficiency while reducing operational challenges and pitfalls. And Grown In Learning, something close to my own heart. Grown In Learning provides required compliance and competency-based training for multi-state cannabis corporations and independent operators. How can Grown In infuse this intelligence into your cannabis operation? Visit grownin.com/learning to schedule a demo. Okay, with all of that aside, I'm excited to introduce our three panelists, and I'm going to talk some more before they start talking. Osbert is based in Long Island and is the CEO and founder of The Cannabis Place, a certified social equity cannabis business launching dispensaries in New York and New Jersey. The Cannabis Place was the first entity to receive service-disabled veteran-owned business designation from New York State. Kaylin is a co-founder and vice president of the New York Cannabis Growers and Processors Association, an advocacy group heavily involved in discussions around adult use cannabis legalization. He's also the founder of Sovereign Vines, America's only hemp-infused wine. Kaylin is also managing director at Castetter Cannabis Group, an advisory firm helping entrepreneurs understand complex regulations in the New York cannabis industry. And finally, Katie Neer is the general counsel and vice president of industry affairs at Lantern, an e-commerce marketplace that facilitates cannabis home delivery. Prior to joining Lantern, Katie was in private practice and gained in-house cannabis experience as the director of government affairs at Acreage Holdings, a multi-state operator, and was chair of the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association. Okay, thank you for listening to all that, everybody. Before we dive in, I want to ask, please use our chat. We are not only encouraging you to chat amongst yourselves, but also if you have questions for any of the panelists, throw it in the chat and we'll get to them. Really excited to have you participate. So I want to start with all of you, but Osbert, I want to ask you to kick it off. In your opinion, what are some of the thorniest issues that still have to be resolved in New York before the cannabis industry the market's going to start rolling, knowing that we don't have any licenses out yet and there's no application process?
Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel, and Katie and Kaylin as well. Thank you for being on this panel with me. I think it's going to be a great opportunity. So first and foremost, I think some of the thorniest issues revolve around here in Long Island, the downstate New York region, revolve around the opt-out process, and where, you know, a lot of municipalities are either opting out completely or, you know, zoning out and zoning businesses out. In other words, saying that you can only be in an industrial area, no matter what type of cannabis operation you want to conduct. So imagine a retail dispensary, but it's, you know, relegated to a industrial area with, you know, lack of continuity with the public, lack of police presence because it's relegated to a industrial area, and an area that is pretty isolated, which makes it dangerous for not only potentially clients coming to, let's say, a dispensary, but also to the workforce, right? Because now you're in an isolated area of town, not in a you know, commercial business zone, where, you know, you get more police presence, you have more traffic flow, more folks coming into your area. And then the next part, because the implementation is not really set in stone yet, is how New York State is actually going to carry forward. We are the first certified service disabled veteran owned business, and that's a separate entity, right? That's the Office of General Services that does that certification process. But that being said, what are the next steps, right? What's OCM going to look for, and how are they going to prioritize? You know, in New Jersey, for example, you have tiers, right? You have social equity applicants, diversely owned businesses, et cetera, impact zones, all of that. New York doesn't really have that truly defined as of yet, and how the actual licensing process is going to view these different types of social equity groups, and categorize them, and then categorize, you know, all of the other applicants as well. So I think those are two of the biggest issues, in my opinion, that exist.
And I want to point out that the AP reported, and I think the Rockefeller Institute's tracking shows that there's about 400 municipalities out of 1,500 in the whole state that have opted out. And the zoning thing that you mentioned, Osbert, is really interesting, because that's like a whole other level that's not necessarily tracked. That's making it certainly more difficult in geographic constricted areas like Long Island.
Yeah, I mean, Long Island is part of, you know, the most populous areas of New York are the downstate region, right? The city, the two counties to the north of New York, and then of New York City, and then the two counties to the east of New York City, which are Nassau and Suffolk County, which compose Long Island. That being said, if you look at a map of Long Island right now, and which municipalities have thus far opted out completely or have very, very restrictive zoning, um, pretty much most of Long Island is a no-go area for business, right? So the only folks that have a footprint in the space right now are, you know, the MSOs that are medical operators, and that will be able to convert some of their licenses over. But from a small business social equity type standpoint, there are no real opportunities across Long Island to say, okay, I want to be, you know, in this particular area or whatever. But there are, as you drive through any community in Long Island, except your most affluent ones, of course, you'll find blighted properties, vacant storefronts, boarded up commercial spaces, etc. And particularly when you go into communities of color on Long Island, and you'll find that exponentially those types of storefronts exist, but yet the opportunity to launch a business that's going to bring jobs to the community, increase tax revenue, all of the positive attributes of the cannabis industry, and to find out that those opportunities won't exist because they've been zoned out. You know, who are you really hurting?
So, Kaylin, what are your thoughts? What are your top thorny issues for New York?
Yeah, I mean, I think these issues also relate to any state that's setting up the cannabis marketplace, and exactly what Osbert was talking about in terms of zoning, and then prioritization for social equity applicants to the selection process, right? The selection process is going to be definitely the most complex and controversial issue, right? As we've seen, as you reported on in Illinois, right? Headed to another round of court challenges, or another date has been set for a hearing, and for those licenses to be awarded, right? So if you're going to limit the amount of licenses, which in some way, shape, or form, I'm sure they will in New York, that means they're going to have to pick those who do get a license and those who don't, right? And so how you do that and how you make it fair, especially to your social equity applicants, is a huge issue. I think also what happens, with the legacy marketplace, right? The highly sophisticated legacy marketplace that exists now, it's existed for decades. What happens to those entrepreneurs, especially those entrepreneurs who, do wish to transition to the legal market? How does the state, facilitate that process? How do they allow for amnesty for any sort of, towards criminal or tax liabilities? I think that's an issue that they have to work out, and that's somewhat novel in terms of how New York will probably approach that. And then what is the role and place for MSOs generally, and more specifically the 10 ROs, the registered organizations that exist in the medical marketplace, and what their role is in the adult use market, and then what how opening and welcoming in the context of a limited licensing situation New York will be, and New York regulators will be, for businesses who are not based in New York and principals who are not New Yorkers, right? And how regulators deal with that. So these are very complicated issues that in some ways New York will definitely get it wrong. That's inevitable. But how they can come in and learn from experiences in other states, I think will be really interesting.
Katie, what's your top big issues?
So I think, I think everything Osbert and Kaylin said, and I agree with, if I was ranking the to-do list, if you will, for the Cannabis Control Board and the OCM, I think first and foremost is some sort of design for how the social equity companies are going to become social equity certified or qualified. Whatever that process is going to look like in New York, I think needs to be outlined and defined in regulation, and very important because everything else kind of flows from there. And next would be the mechanics of how they're issuing these licenses. So there's a lot of talk about, are there going to be license caps or not? For example, that's a huge decision point that these regulators need to make. That's not in the statute. And you see that in statute in some other markets, but not in New York. And I think that was by design to give this regulator the flexibility to kind of push and pull economic levers to make a very competitive and robust and equitable marketplace emerge in New York. And one of the third big challenges that they have on their plate is how to do that in a way that invites the legacy market into the regulated space. And as Kaylin pointed out, the legacy market in New York is super competitive, super sophisticated, very well run. There's really high quality, great products that's very convenient and at a good price point. And so how does a regulated market compete with that? How do the regulators welcome those operators into the space? And how does the marketplace convince the consumer to come into the regulated market with the operators that they're comfortable with now? So that's a huge undertaking. I don't know that I have any answers, but in my mind, those are sort of those big picture problems or challenges that the regulator needs to be clear about when they then roll out their implementation plan and draft their regulations.
So that kind of goes into the next thing, which is, so we need to have regulations for how the applications are going to be accepted, right? And also we need to decide if there's going to be a limit, or the Office of Cannabis Management and the Cannabis Control Board and CCB need to decide if there's going to be a limited number of licenses and how they're going to be rolled out. That's huge, very complicated, and requires a lot of stakeholder buy-in in a lot of different ways. So as I reported earlier this week, the Cannabis Control Board, and some of you have told me, is the Cannabis Control Board and OCM are not full, and they're struggling to get all their people together, knowing that they're staffed, and we have a gubernatorial primary coming up in June. What would each of you have to say about what we should expect in terms of when regulations will come out and what will they look like? Katie, do you want to kick off?
Sure. So I think the OCM has been hustling and working with the governor's office to get staff onboarded as quickly as they can. It takes time under normal circumstances in New York, and then you layer on top of it a huge shift in administration midterm, which it's just a lot of disruption to deal with. So I think a huge amount of staff started on December 1st. And, I think in today's meeting, the staff of the OCM will put forth another chunk of a staffing plan for the CCB approval. So hopefully they can kind of get things going early next year and maybe start to drop some regulations, in that first quarter. I would love if it was like February, March, when we were seeing some draft regs to respond to and get some public comment going. And I think it would be smart if they dropped regs in chunks of subject matter rather than waiting to do the whole comprehensive reg package all at once. they have an enormous amount of work to sift through, in addition to the CBD and hemp programming that's underway, and they've got a slew of applications to work through on that front. They also have a big chunk of regulatory reforms to implement on the medical program. And then, of course, kind of this wholesale approach for the adult use rollout. So I think hopefully they'll start to tackle them in buckets, drop them for public comment, and we can kind of get everyone engaged and get going.
Osbert, if you're a betting man, when do you think we'll start to see something?
I agree with Katie. I think that, because June 2022 is a big date on the Governor Hochul's agenda. You've already seen some other Democrats that had announced the run now pull back and withdraw their run for the governor's position, and so I think there's a consolidation going on, and because of that, I think that the governor is going to want to have a win, a feather in her cap for a win with having regulation on the table. I am concerned with with the fact that there's some talk of a lottery system. I don't agree with that at all. I think that I actually further does harm to the whole social equity standpoint, because a lottery for licensing would really not go to the quality of the actual packet and application, kind of like New Jersey's doing they have a grading matrix and that you have to follow, and to maximize and to really clearly see the parameters of who can get a license based on the score that they receive for the application. If New York were to go to a lottery, that's just out the window. It's a dollar and a dream, and so I don't agree with that at all, because I don't think that will provide the most viable candidates that will be successful, right? That's just somebody with a winning lotto ticket, and I don't agree with that. But I do agree with Katie. Again, I do see it happening before the June primary.
Kaylin?
Well, yeah, I think
what are your bets?
Yeah, well, I think, a competitive primary is not good for the swift rollout of cannabis regulations, right? Because, when you have a competitive primary, which actually at this point, I wouldn't necessarily consider the primary to be competitive with Letitia James dropping out. I would say, the advantage on the incumbent drastically increased once, Tish did announce that she's dropping out of the race. But, I do think that, when you have an election, the governor's election really is decided in June, just like the New York City mayor's race was decided in June, right? The Democratic primary. I think there's a lot of pressure to not have things go wrong. And I think there's a lot of ways that, the regulations could upset certain stakeholders. And so what I think we need is a robust public comment period, probably 2 public comment periods. Because if there's 2 public comment periods, that means there's changes after the first one, material changes. And so I think you do see that. And I think, I think Katie's right. I think, February is maybe an aggressive ask for the OCM, with, recently being staffed out to have draft regs available, but I think it could certainly happen. It's not like this, it's not like the MRTA doesn't give a lot of guidance in terms of what the lawmakers wanted to see happen, especially when we talk about equity and what the composition of the marketplace is going to be. So yeah, I think, the end of Q1, we see draft regs. I think, then you see about, 4 or 5 months worth of a rulemaking process, a public comment period.
And the public comment period in New York is how long?
So the first one will have to be 60. And I believe subsequent public comment periods don't necessarily have to be 60. And then there's also a review period after that. The final regs are adopted too. So.
Okay, so you imagine that, let's just sort of game this out. February, something comes out, 60 days of comment. So that puts you into April. And then some period of time where, a month where internally they play with the regulations, make substantive changes, and then put out again for another comment period, for another 60-day comment period. You think that's a likely possibility?
Well, yeah, I mean, not just, changing the regs, they have to respond to every unique comment. And that results in the, from the public comment period. So yeah, I think you have 60 days. I think you have at least a month to respond to those comments and maybe make changes for new regulations. That could be 2 months even. And then another public comment period. I believe at that point they could do a 30-day public comment period, but I'm not quite sure. Katie, is that correct? They could do 30 after that?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah.
So April, then 2 months, putting you into June, another 30 days, putting you into July, sometime July, late July, early August is when regs would be finalized and possibly opening up for applications. Does that seem?
I think that
possible?
seems a little soon. I think you really look at, so actually there was an article that came out today from the chair saying that they wanted, applications open up in September. So I think September is an aggressive timeline too, and she categorized it as such. So I really think you're looking at towards the, latter half of next year for any sort of applications to be open.
So, and so then there's probably a 3 month or so application period where people are putting in their applications. So, we're looking at January, February of 2023, optimistically, and then probably, another month or so in order to go through all those applications, and then they start spitting them out, so maybe we wouldn't see people receiving applications until April of 2023 at the earliest. Does that all sound?
Yeah, I think first quarter of 2023 is a realistic timeline, just based on everything that's happening. They still have to set up the process. They still have to select what the tracking system is going to be, what the application portal is going to be. That all of those processes have to be defined, set up, implemented. Are they going to go with somebody that's already on state contract with New York State OGS, or are they going to have a new, brand new proposal process that would actually delay the process? So I hope they go with somebody that's on an existing state bid. But all of those types of measures that, things they can do that potentially could save time. But if they were to go and do everything organically within OCM, it'll definitely delay things further.
Okay, so we've heard a lot about the strength of the underground market in New York City. But I want to ask each of you, in your opinion, how strong is it beyond the city? Is this a real threat for other businesses once you get outside of the immediate New York City area?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Western New York is a great example, right? I mean, the strength of the legacy market in Buffalo is huge, and it's similar to what you see in New York City in terms of events and retailers and everything like that. And this is nothing new, right? And so in terms of threat to regulated operators, the state will decide how much of a threat they really are, because there is a certain amount of price elasticity amongst cannabis consumers. And if the state, moves forward with the THC cultivation tax and they impose a lot of other, burdens that are unnecessary, then, the price difference between which you could buy in the unregulated market and the regulated marketplace is going to be significant. If that price difference isn't significant, and they also allow for innovation amongst products and, a healthy amount of competition in the regulated marketplace, then I don't see why a legal operator really has much to worry about, because they're producing a product that consumers want, and providing an easier way for those consumers to purchase them.
Oscar, what's it like in Long Island? I've in Illinois and in Michigan, sometimes there's underground dispensaries. Do you see those kind of things on Long Island?
How about this? There are locations, I'll use town of Brookhaven as an example, where, they have very aggressive zoning requirements. Again, someone wanting to come into the space in a legal manner will have to go into an industrial market. But your underground dispensaries are on Main Street. Pick your town, whether it's Village of Patchogue, Port Jefferson, etc. These are, the downtown districts and nice areas, affluent, etc. You can walk into some places and they have cannabis literally on the shelf, and or there's pop-up events where it's a outdoor festival and they have music and food trucks and everything, and open market cannabis being sold on literally in all these main corridors. So the whole aspect of the regulatory aspect of saying, not in my backyard. It's here. Cannabis has been an integral part of Long Island for decades, decades and decades, and it's always existed. It'll continue to exist in an underground capacity. Back to Kaylin's point, I think it's important.
So when you say on Main Street, are these just like head shops that are disguised, they look like head shops, but you go inside and they're really a dispensary, or what is it?
They run the full gamut, right? You have folks that are pizza shops that are doing fused stuff for bakeries, or I mean, it's such, because there is a lack of a way for folks to legally purchase cannabis. There's a lot of entrepreneurs that are out there and that are bringing the market to reality before the state gets in motion with its process. And you can go on Instagram, you can go on Twitter, whatever, and look at these areas and find plenty of places. If you want to get deliveries to your house, you can get that. It's super accessible, and so I think that the state really needs to get the ball rolling if they don't want to happen what's going on in California with the legacy market versus the adult use market, where that is a very, very competitive space with these two marketplaces. And if the aim of the MRTA is true social equity and to create opportunities and to bring this whole marketplace to reality, then measures need to be taken to make this happen sooner rather than later. Otherwise, the new, like the legacy market and the new legacy market, as I like to refer to it, that's happening now post MRTA, it's a very growing industry, not separate from your previous legacy industry of 2 years ago or 10 years ago. It's growing exponentially because people see it as an opportunity and to harness their entrepreneurial spirit.
So I want to keep this conversation going. It's really interesting. And we also have a great conversation in chat right now. If anybody, you have any questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. If you have questions for our panelists, and I'll be asking them in a few minutes. Katie, you are ensconced in Albany. Can I say that? Can I say that you're ensconced? So you've been talking to all these minions of government and all of their thinking. How do they think about the underground market? What do they think about it? Is it or is it just sort of, oh, we'll deal with that later?
I think it's front of mind, at least, with the policymakers that I'm talking to regularly and working with. It's not just talking points in New York. The principles, the social equity principles and goals that were embedded into the MRTA have been negotiated and advocated for by this massive kind of campaign and group of advocates for years. I mean, decades, but really intensely for the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. And the legislation that was being negotiated and kind of drafted back and forth the last couple of years between former Governor Cuomo's office and his people and the legislature was just wildly different. And what ended up getting over the finish line is remarkably closer to what the advocates wanted and what the legislature has been championing for years. And so I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the legislative leaders who sponsored that bill and the advocates who kind of did all the grassroots organizing to get it across the finish line are going to remain engaged with this regulator to make sure there's accountability, that the implementation is in line with the legislative intent. And, I do a lot of work with the MSOs that are in New York now, the existing medical operators, and they understand that completely too. They know that. They tried to be a part of that negotiation. They were a part of that negotiation over the last few years, and they understand that social equity is absolutely going to have to be done differently in New York and mean something different in New York and be more than just that talking point. And so I think the regulators are spending most of their time right now trying to figure out how to do that. which is hard because there's not another state that you can look at and say they got it right. And that was a true success story yet. And I think New York wants to be that state, which builds a lot of pressure for these regulators. And as stakeholders, I think it's important that we're all kind of communicating and transparent about our own needs and wants so that we can have this kind of open dialogue to try to solve the problem and make the puzzle pieces fit where hopefully there can be a reasonable win-win for everyone. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game or a zero-sum industry.
So we keep hearing social equity interwoven with the question of underground markets, and those two really connect in a lot of ways. In Illinois, the regulators really tried to put their thumb on the scale in favor of social equity and ended up slipping and then putting their thumb on the other side of the scale by accident. So they weren't very successful. They were somewhat successful, but they didn't get to majority or even 50% of the applicants having social equity. So New York has a 50% goal of social equity applicants. Osbert, is that realistic?
So I've had this conversation with a few people, right? And social equity, the term is a very huge term, right? What does that mean? It may mean something different to me or to you, right? So I grew up in a public housing project. While I was never arrested for any type of cannabis offense, I consider myself collateral damage in the war on drugs, meaning that I can't even tell you how many times I was stopped by police walking down the street, just doing nothing wrong, going to hang out or whatever, just walking to and from school. And so in some places, social equity means you have to have been arrested. In other places, social equity, impact zones, right? I would be a person that came from an impact zone, right? In some other descriptives are women, minority-owned businesses, the LGBTQ plus community, disabled veterans. So it really needs to be drilled down to who is covered by the social equity umbrella. Once you do that, and you have these categories covered of who qualifies to be under this umbrella, the next thing you need to realize is social equity, really, you need financial equity, because you may fit under every category under that umbrella, but if you don't have the ability to file for an application fee, to start a corporation or an LLC, to retain a lawyer or a CPA, or have people on your team to help you, or retain a consultant to help you file for an application, it's all for naught. It's all just, fodder, because you may be a social equity applicant, but if you don't have the wherewithal to actually apply and to negotiate a real estate lease, to be able to put down those 3 months of on your commercial lease, and to get an insurance or to get a bond, or so many things that you need to actually do to start a cannabis operation, no matter what space you want to be in. What does it mean that 50% of the licenses are set aside if you actually can't get to that point to actually apply for the license? Or if you're able to apply for the license, to have the capital to successfully launch a business, to be successful in the cannabis space. I'm going to share a quick story with you. I was at an event in Nevada recently, in Las Vegas. I'm not going to say the name of the event. Everyone that knows the cannabis space knows the recent event that occurred. But I was at a mixer event, and I had an individual sit across the table from me and engage me in conversation. And so, who are you, whatever. So I tell him, I'm Latino, Latinx, disabled veteran, and his eyes lit up. And ultimately, on a napkin, he wrote a pitch to me. And it was a devaluation pitch, right? Where, him and his team are active in 11 states in multiple aspects of the cannabis space, and they needed a face for their applications here in New Jersey and New York. And he basically pitched me. And it's, you are 51% owner, but at year 3 or whenever the license is able to be sold, you automatically become devalued and you become a 1% owner and you get bought out. That's a front. That's a pass-through. That's not social equity. That's pimping someone out because of the color of their skin or their gender or their disabled veteran status or their sexuality. So that is something that I think that the OCM needs to be laser focused on to prevent those types of things from happening, because New York State has been successful in the MWBE space for going after front companies that are fronted by that have owners, true ownership, that are not the represented person that's at the forefront of the company. And I think that needs to be something that New York focuses on, to make sure that these pass-through front companies don't come in and exploit the 50% license, the 50% of the licenses to, in essence, buy a license 3 years down the road.
And we've reported on those things happening in Illinois and also in Massachusetts, those exact same kind of things. Kaylin,
yeah,
is it realistic? I mean, for your members, and do you think that that's something that can be done? And if so, what needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it absolutely can be done. And part of the reason why is there's a pretty wide aperture in terms of what constitutes social equity. And if it's not done, that is representative of a massive failure on the part of New York State regulators. And that's not necessarily a failure of their selection process. It's a failure of them failing to understand the barriers to entry that they need to lower through the regulatory process in order for this to happen, right? I mean, the major barriers are capital, access to capital. New York State can absolutely, someone in the comments said New York State's financial capital world, absolutely. So you need to be creative, including a private and public partnership in terms of access to capital and providing, capital, but also knowledge, a transfer of knowledge, right? And incubator programs. You know what? Maybe the incubator programs take some time to set up, and maybe those incubes aren't the first ones to the market, but they need to have a pathway to the marketplace, right? Compliance, overburdensome compliance. This idea that cannabis should be treated any differently from a compliance perspective from alcohol is absurd, right? It should not be treated as a pharmaceutical drug. And we talk about packaging and labeling requirements, and all these things are ridiculous. And innovation. If you starve the ability for New York entrepreneurs to be able to innovate from products and concepts from on-premise consumption to dispensaries, et cetera, because of overburdensome requirements, then you are setting them up to fail. So, you have to allow them, you have to reduce the barriers to entry, and then allow the market to do what it's going to do and what it has done for, decades. Because the reality is that New York, while we might not have we don't have a legal marketplace that's been in place in, California and Colorado for years, entrepreneurs in New York have been driving the culture around cannabis for decades. And they have been driving the innovations for decades just in an unregulated marketplace. So New York needs to take those concerns very seriously, and regulators need to listen to business leaders, whether those business leaders are operating regulated or not.
Katie, you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and the law, so the MRTA includes all of these different components. So it makes it distinct from what we've seen in other states, in that it includes, a state administered social equity fund. So I expect that we might even see this, the Hochul administration in her state of the state and in her agenda early next year announce that she wants to make a state allocation into that fund. I think that would be a great thing to do. In addition to any state allocation that might be coming, those existing medical operators will get assessed a one-time fee for the privilege of remaining or getting into the adult use market and remaining vertically integrated. And that fee will also go into the state administered social equity fund. And so that's a unique component of the New York law that hopefully will start to solve the access to capital problem for social equity businesses. It's not going to be a full solve, because I think you'd have to have like hundreds of millions of dollars in there. But maybe they can get there. Maybe they can get that going, and it can be like a constant source of funding and support. And then additionally, the law is going to mandate a state administered incubator program as well, which there's a million, private incubators out there. Lantern, our kind of worldview is like any market we're going to do business in or want to do business in, we're going to have an incubator that we run. So we have one in Massachusetts. we teamed up with a local operator in Detroit, and we helped run the Detroit Cannabis Project there. And then we support a nonprofit in Denver, the Color of Cannabis, in their incubator. And we just launched the New Jersey Cannabis Project, which is a lantern run incubator. And we'll do something similar in New York for sure. But those types of programs and that kind of support is critical to hitting that 50% goal in New York. But I think New York can do it. I think they can get there.
So, okay, we have a few questions, and I want to start this first one with Kaylin, because I think that this is probably more up your alley. Do you see the big banks and investment firms of New York moving before the usual providers can? And I think what they mean are the MSOs rather than big banks and investment firms. Do you think the MSOs in New York are going to be able to start selling on the adult use market before everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that the question's well framed because, they're private equity backed, right? So when we talk about private equity, the ROs in New York or, MSOs in general, they don't have access to traditional lines of capital. So they go to, other markets, and that plays well to the private equity model. The ROs don't have to go first in New York, right? That's the answer. We can roll this out in synchronicity. I mean, I think, do the ROs play an important role in the marketplace in New York? Maybe at the beginning, and then I think you allow competition to kind of, settle that question out over the next several years. I mean, is it necessarily fair that there's 10 chosen companies in New York that will be vertically integrated in a very large capacity and no one else can? No. And so I think New York regulators are going to have to address that also, and potentially lawmakers will have to address that, right? We need a level playing field. And so I don't think when we say a level playing field, that necessarily excludes the ROs and the private equity backed companies now. But it, is inclusive of many entrepreneurs being able to get a start and access to, the marketplaces in New York.
So this question I'm going to pose for Katie. Katie, what is the outlook for wholesale distribution regulations and permits? You think that's something that they're going to allow in New York State?
So the law contemplates it. There is a wholesale distributor license that's in the law. So I think that'll be a license type. Interestingly, if you have a cultivation license and you're processing your own product, the law says you can also distribute your own product, but you can't distribute anyone else's product without that third-party distributor license. And you can't stack that license type with any other kind of type of license. So well known in New York that the alcohol distributors pushed really hard for that license type to be there. They really want that 3-tier system. This is kind of a 3-tier system. It's a 3-tier system with a lot of exceptions. So I think it's to be seen how it gets utilized. Certainly if I were advising a cultivator and processor, a brand that wanted to get their product statewide to as many retailers as possible, I'd say you should probably talk to a third-party distributor and have a deal in place. So I think they'll be successful. I think they'll do good business in New York.
One more question, which is banking in New York. New York has all these big banks, but they're all national chartered banks, federally chartered banks. How are people going to be able to find banking in New York State? Is that something that is an issue that's going to be able to be addressed?
Yeah, no community banks. Yeah, the community banks in New York and the credit unions.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, they'll be a huge part of this, and I think they're really excited about it.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. There are definitely some community banks out there that are being very proactive in that space, and so banking will be something. You're not going to be able to bank at your large multinational bank, but community banks, credit unions, there are some that are, you just have to approach and make a relationship. It's not something that a lot of them are posting online.
Right. Okay. I want to thank the three of you very, very much for being part of this today. Katie Neer, Osbert Odunya, and Kaylin Castetter. It's been really great having you. I think this is a terrific conversation. And I also want to thank our sponsors, American Cannabis Company, Englewood Construction, Grown In Learning. Our next webinar on small operators compare notes in different states is scheduled for January 25th at 12:30 p.m. Central Time. Hope you can join us. Again, thank you to the three of you. This was a lot of fun. I actually enjoyed myself. So
Yeah, loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all.